The way you want to think about negatives in terms of climate is climate danger. That's the key concept. So if you ask, what has happened to climate danger in the last 100 years? It's declined precipitously.
Today I sit down with Epstein, author of Fossil Future: Why Global Human Flourishing Requires More Oil, Coal, and Natural Gas, Not Less.
They very cleverly masked this anti-human, anti-technology agenda. You look at how glorified being green is, but what does green mean? It just means less impact, right? The ideal green planet is the Earth that would exist had human beings never existed.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellick. Epstein, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Hey, my pleasure. Very, very nice location we got here.
Absolutely, and very relevant, I think, to what we're going to talk about today. Viewers of this show know that a common mantra of mine is, my goodness, how could the experts have gotten so much wrong over the past few years? It's kind of unbelievable. But you actually, as I read Fossil Future, especially the first few chapters, you talk about exactly how a whole seeming consensus of experts can get things wrong. And I want to start with that. How does that work?
I think it's a great, first of all, it's a great question. And it's something that has really bothered me a lot in my life, because I try to always be historical in my thinking. I think there's a conceit that we can have that, oh, everyone in the past, they were wrong and they were stupid and they did things like slavery and racism and eugenics, but we would never be that stupid. And what we do is obviously right, and the rest of history will view it as right. And like, that doesn't seem very likely, because that's what the past thought too, right? Even the Germany, when they're voting in Nazism by a plurality, like they're in some way thinking they're right. They're thinking they're progressive in the sense of they're forward-looking, and yet you look back and you see that majorities are very often wrong, but also that them being wrong is often connected to the alleged experts. So it's like, well, these like slavery, racism, these things were viewed as scientific. Eugenics, like they have a strong alleged science to them. And so that's scary, where what we're told the experts think can be murderously wrong, not just a little wrong, but murderously wrong. And one thing I realized is that a big part of what's going on there is not that these really murderous bad conclusions come from the actual researchers themselves, but it comes from some set of factors distorting the research. That's a really interesting kind of thing. So it's like, okay, well, there are advances in genetics or something, that doesn't logically lead to eugenics, in my view, and I don't think in many people's view, but people would distort those. And so one thing I talk about is, when we're getting what is considered expert guidance on some issue, it's actually coming through what I call a knowledge system, a set of people and institutions that has four main phases. One is the research phase, but then that research, to be useful to us, has to be synthesized dramatically. And even if all the research is right, which is hard enough in the first place, the synthesis can be way off. And then after that, it has to be further synthesized and what I call disseminated, so that it's accessible to somebody who's just reading the paper and has very limited bandwidth. And then the last step, and this is the least appreciated one, is the evaluation stage. So whatever is the disseminated truth in a field, even if that's true, you could have a totally wrong evaluation. So an example, let's just say you have a disseminated truth that COVID is a new virus and it's, significantly dangerous. We don't have antibodies in response to it or whatever. But then people went from that to, the policy should be to zero out COVID at all costs, like eliminate this one virus at all costs. But whatever the science is, that doesn't follow, right? Because when you're thinking about policy, you can't just think about one virus. You need to think about all the threats to human life and all the potential benefits to human life. So I think COVID's a clear-cut case where whatever the science is, you can see how science can be distorted for a certain evaluation. And the danger is when people say, oh, well, listen to the scientists or listen to the experts. And what they think is, oh, this zero COVID policy is scientific. And the truth is, actually, no one science can ever dictate policy. They can just inform policy. So whatever the best science on COVID is, we want to know, and that's hard enough, as we've seen in many cases. But we should never make the mistake of thinking that a specific set of experts in a specific field can dictate policy. Policy always depends on multiple fields, and it depends on your particular values. And if we don't keep that in mind, we're going to do terrible things and think it's the experts.
Well, and indeed, we seen that actually happen, play out in real time over the last few years. And there's another element. So, you have this really helpful and logical breakdown of these points of failure where you go from, actual experts who are doing, many of which are doing, pretty good research to, an interpretation and policy around this research is totally devoid of what the original findings were, or largely devoid. There's this other element, and I'm curious how you see this fit into the whole stop climate change at any cost narrative. Is there were actual experts in the COVID context who were, trying to get information out that would counter the prevailing narratives and counter the prevailing policies, and they were basically kind of pushed aside or called fringe epidemiologists or whatnot, right? And so this is this other piece. So we kind of need, I've been struggling with this. We need experts to interpret things, but it seems like most experts are really failing us, right?
Well, yeah, what I would call designated experts. So there's a class of people who are designated as the spokespeople for all experts. And sometimes there's somebody like in climate science, there's a guy named Michael Mann who's an actual researcher in the field. Now, granted, he's got a lot of controversy and I think a lot of problems, but nevertheless, he's a researcher. But then also he is trusted to summarize climate science. And then crucially, he's trusted to make good evaluations of policy, which I argue he does a terrible job at because he totally ignores the benefits of fossil fuels. But I think you have those designated experts, but I think part of what the problem is we need more of a separation between expertise in a given field and then policy. And particularly with policy, we need a very free, kind of open debate about things with openness to a lot of factors. So even think about COVID, whatever, because you can stipulate, even if everyone agreed on the science, there's a lot of different views of what policy should be just based on different risk tolerances and all kinds of things. So one of the dangers I think we saw with COVID is it becomes so political in terms of people want to have a political view that is called the science. And so that doesn't, as I said, the political view can't follow from the science, but part of what it does is it also percolates into science negatively, because anyone in science who's saying anything that would seem to contradict the political narrative is like, they become persona non grata. It's no longer, hey, here's a person expressing an opinion, we can take it or leave it. It's this person is derailing my political agenda. And I think that's what happened with a lot of the opposition to like lockdowns. Like anyone who was seen as, well, they're opposing lockdowns, they're a crank. And now I think certain people who were opposing lockdowns were cranks, and I think certain people definitely weren't. And you get the same thing in with energy and climate. Like anyone who derails the I forget what you put it as, end climate change at all costs narrative, or what's often called the net zero thing. What are they called? They're called climate change denier, and you shouldn't listen to them at all. And you have this even with recognized prestigious climate scientists who have had decades of experience doing this and have real achievements in the field. So somebody like Richard Lindzen, who who's emeritus at MIT and was one of the most impressive people in the field for a long time. Like you have Congress people who are just like, oh, that's an idiot climate denier. It's like, wait a second, you know nothing about this field, right? This is somebody who has real achievement in the field. Even if he's wrong, he knows a lot more than you do, but you feel comfortable dismissing him out of hand, you who know nothing. And I think it's because it's become so political. So Lindzen is just viewed as, this is just a guy getting in the way of my political agendas. I think we need to separate the political agendas. We need to just say, we're going to try to factor in the best science, but part of that is we want a robust debate about politics, and we want to be open to different views in science. Although I think in science there is room. It's important to know what's the state of consensus. That doesn't mean we should obey it, but you want to know. But even that needs to be explained very carefully. And one thing I've pointed out is you hear these numbers like 97% of climate scientists agree, and invariably the consensus is distorted to promote the policy. So today we hear 97% of climate scientists agree, and the actual studies say they agree that we have some climate impact, not at all catastrophic impact. But yet that's interpreted to mean 97% of climate scientists agree with the net zero agenda, which doesn't follow at all. So again, it's the science is being perverted or distorted to advance this set political agenda.
Hey everyone, I've got a special announcement. We're launching a Sunday Watch Party series. Many of you have told us that you want to share some of our best episodes with your friends and family so they can be more informed about what's going on. So every Sunday at 7:30 p.m. Eastern, we'll be re-premiering some of our best American Thought Leaders episodes for subscribers and non-subscribers alike. It's free to everybody. And if you have a suggestion for the next American Thought Leaders episode that you'd like to see for our Sunday watch party, or email us at atl@epochtimes.com. I look forward to seeing you all on the live chat this Sunday.
I'm going to get you to make your quick case in a moment for me, but there's a couple of things I wanted to ask you. Have you ever thought about how similar this phraseology of, net zero and zero COVID is? Has that ever struck you?
I've thought about the zero in general. I don't know if they're both bad as a goal, but like net zero is much worse than zero COVID.
Okay.
Much, much worse than zero COVID. In the sense of zero COVID is all things being equal, that would be something you would want. Like, I don't know many people who say, I'm really glad this coronavirus came along. Like, we should have some of it. You can say it's not, once it's out there, it's not a realistic goal and it's a damaging goal. I certainly think
right.
that's the case. And I think the best people were saying that from the beginning. Like, this is going to become an endemic virus. It's going to be like the flu, and absent some just total breakthrough in vaccination and other things, like this is going to be with us for a long time, and it's going to be an issue, but it'll be progressively less of an issue as we develop immunity. Whereas like net zero is, part of the reason I say it's worse is that, well, I believe pursuing it would be much worse. We'd have to get into that. But I think that trying to zero out our use of fossil fuels or even our emissions from fossil fuels on a 27-year time frame, I think that would be the single, and I mean this literally, I think that would be the single most destructive act in human history in terms of depriving people of energy and shutting down civilization. But then also I think the reason why it's bad is because net zero climate, it's really net zero climate impact. It's part of a broader movement that says that our impact in general is bad. And this is why I find it so abhorrent. I talk about this a lot in Fossil Future.
Where you talk about this anti-human framework.
Or anti-impact framework.
Which I thought was very fascinating.
Yeah, so if you look at, my basic premise is that the underlying goal of so much of what's going on with energy and environment is this view that human impact on nature is evil and we should eliminate it as much as possible. And that is such, when I was 18, I learned some pro-human environmental philosophy, and I didn't know anything about energy back then, and so I was still afraid of climate catastrophe, but I really concluded that the green movement was anti-human because I realized, wait a second, they're against human impact, one, and two, humans survive and flourish by impacting the earth. So you're against our means of survival. But that's really true, and you look at how glorified being green is, but what does green mean? It just means less impact, right? The ideal green planet is the earth that would exist had human beings never existed. So we have I believe we have a very deep-seated anti-humanism in our culture that's been growing over the past few decades and generations, and that's why I find when you say like net zero CO2, it's part of a broader thing of let's not impact the earth at all. And to me, that's the same as saying let's have a lot fewer humans. Because if somebody said, hey, I'm for zero bear impact, that means you want to kill all the bears, right? And I think it's the same thing. Like, to be against human impact is to be against human life, because again, we survive and flourish via impact.
Wow, this is beginning to sound a bit like the depopulation agenda I keep hearing about.
Well, it's the underlying idea, right? But and that's sometimes viewed as conspiracy, but if you look at the history of it, this was a very overt belief during the early modern environmental movements in the late 60s and in the 70s. Depopulation, and usually put as, well, we have a problem with overpopulation. Well, how do you solve a problem with overpopulation? You depopulate. There's no other solution to it, quote unquote. And that was a very popular idea. Like Paul Ehrlich, his ideas never seem to die. No matter, he's the most wrong person in recent history. Just every prediction he makes is 180 degrees wrong. He says the world will end and it gets much better. But he, in the 60s, he was on like the Johnny Carson show many, many times, which, and that's just considered you're a totally normal person. I mean, imagine somebody who's on, Jimmy Kimmel and Jimmy Fallon and all these different shows. That was just a normal idea, as was, interestingly, anti-technology. So in the 70s, it was quite common for environmental activists to say, we're against technology. Basically what they learned is both of those are bad messaging. So if you put it as impact, if you put it as we're anti-population and anti-technology, it's too literal. It's too literally anti-human, and so people pick up on it. But if you say I'm against impact, what happens is impact is a vague term in the sense of it can mean impacts that harm us or impacts that help us. So when people think, oh, we want to minimize impact, they just think, oh, we want less air pollution or less water pollution or less unnecessary destruction of natural beauty. You think, oh, great, sign me up, like get me on that minimize impact bus. But wait a second, minimize human impact also means minimize farms, factories, roads, everything that makes the world livable for 8 billion people. And so they very cleverly masked this anti-human, anti-technology agenda under, oh, let's minimize impact. But that's why I like to take it literally, like, wait a second, we survive by impact. And so what my argument is, we should replace this with what I call a human flourishing perspective, which is we want the earth to be as good a place as possible for human flourishing, which means we need to have as much positive impact as possible. We want to maximize our positive impacts, and we want to minimize our negative impacts, and that's going to allow us to really to have a world that 8 billion people can enjoy, including things like natural beauty and clean air and clean water.
Or possibly, or more, right, I guess.
Or more than 8 billion?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, but I mean, we have a lot of depopulation population reduction problems. Yeah, I mean, my view is there's nothing, I mean, we could easily have twice the population if you have free countries that are allowed to use technology, because the basic elements in terms of like food and water, like we have limitless ability to produce those, provided that we're not restricted in our ability to create value. But the green movement is totally attacking that.
Right. Well, so let's take this moment and give me your case, like the sort of the elevator pitch version, because your book is I'm just going to commend you here. You're an incredibly logical thinker, and you take people through basically all the way from the beginnings of the issues with the existing arguments to all the way through to what does a good world look like? What does human flourishing look like, right? And what is a positive vision with fossil fuels? So, but give me the sort of the short version of your argument here.
So the subtitle of the book is, so it's called Fossil Future, and then Why Global Human Flourishing Requires More Oil, Coal, and Natural Gas, Not Less. And so the first part we've talked about a bit, so global human flourishing, but it's important that I'm putting it in terms of global human flourishing, because the prevailing way of thinking of it is our goal should be to eliminate our impact in general, but particularly our CO2 emissions. And my view is that is a bad goal. Even if CO2 emissions are like a way bigger challenge than I think they are, it can't be your main goal. It's like COVID, right? It's like even with eliminating COVID cannot be your main goal. At most, it's an it's an aspect of promoting human flourishing. So one is just we should be thinking, if we're thinking about global issues, it should be about global human flourishing. So that's a very distinctive thing, because my argument is 99% of thinkers on this topic are not thinking in terms of global human flourishing. They're thinking in terms of eliminating CO2 emissions. And my evidence is, how many countries have made an energy abundance pledge? How many countries have made a human flourishing pledge? How many companies have? How many financial institutions have? All the countries and major companies and financial institutions, they all have net zero pledges. So their animating moral goal is no climate impact. And I think the first thing is to step back and say that's the wrong goal. So absent whatever the science is, like the goal should be global human flourishing. Climate is at most one aspect of that. So that's why I stress that. And then when you're thinking about, so I'm saying more oil, coal, and natural gas, not less. And then the next thing I say, I mean, it's ordered a little differently in the book, is that if we're thinking about, should we continue using fossil fuels, that's oil, coal, and natural gas, should we diminish them, should we increase them, you're looking at it from a human flourishing perspective, and essential to doing that is you need to carefully weigh the benefits and the negative side effects of that. And I argue that in our culture, we tend to only look at negative side effects and not benefits, and that's a terrible, terrible way of thinking of it. So for example, I mentioned this guy, Michael Mann. He has a whole book on fossil fuels and climate, but when he talks about food, he only talks about, hey, what are the negative side effects of fossil fuel use on food? And that's a fine thing to look at it's a good thing to look at insofar as you're doing it accurately, which I don't think he is. But revealingly, he has nothing about the benefits of fossil fuels to food, even though fossil fuels literally make it possible to feed 8 billion people because they provide the fuel for all the amazing agricultural equipment, particularly diesel fuel, which is very hard to replace. And also they provide natural gas, which is the basis of modern fertilizer that allows us to feed 8 billion people. So my view is you need to carefully weigh the benefits and side effects. And actually my argument is if you do that, it's pretty obvious that we need more fossil fuels. And the basic reason is the benefits of having what I call cost-effective energy, so low-cost, reliable energy that's versatile, it can power every type of machine, that's scalable, that can provide energy for billions of people in thousands of places. That's literally the difference between poverty and prosperity, between danger and safety. Like when you have a lot of energy, you have an abundant and safe world. When you don't, you have a deficient and dangerous world. So the benefits are so huge. They're desperately needed. So there are 6 billion people who use an amount of energy that we in the US would consider unacceptable. There are 3 billion people of those who are using less electricity in their lives than a typical refrigerator of ours. So you just think about the world, energy is so crucial, it's so desperately needed, and then nothing is close to fossil fuels for the next several decades. Fossil fuels are 80% of the world's energy. They're still growing. They're growing particularly in parts of the world that care most about cost-effective energy, such as China, which I just posted on Twitter today, has more coal plants in the pipeline than we have coal plants, period. They have more new coal plants planned to last 40 plus years than we have coal plants, period. Never mind their huge inventory of existing coal plants. So fossil fuels are uniquely cost-effective for the foreseeable future. So you've got this thing that's crucial to life. Billions more people need it. Fossil fuels are uniquely able to provide it. And then the final thing, because everyone is concerned about climate, is fossil fuels actually make us safer from climate. They give us an ability to neutralize climate danger. So for example, not just heating and cooling, although that saves millions of lives, but building sturdy buildings using high energy machines, and maybe most significantly, alleviating drought through irrigation and through crop transport. Drought is historically the biggest climate killer. It used to kill millions of people a year, like 10 million people some years adjusted for population. Now it's less than 1/100th of that. So fossil fuels, unlike say a prescription drug where you have benefits and you have negative side effects and sometimes the benefits outweigh them, fossil fuels have this unique ability to cure their own side effects. Because when you have energy, you can neutralize almost any danger, right? So even if we made drought worse in the atmosphere, we could be 10 times better at fighting it because of all the energy that we have. And that's why I think it's obvious, because once you realize how beneficial fossil fuels are, including how good they are at protecting us from climate danger, and you realize we've already been affecting the climate for 100 plus years, and we're safer than ever from climate, you have to think of the only way fossil fuels could really be a problem that would justify restricting, let alone eliminating them, is if the climate change just totally changed. Like it went from, oh, it's something we can totally deal with and be fine with, and then suddenly we're going to have some devil climate that just ruins everything. And as I argue in the book, there's no science to support this at all. There's science to say we'll continue to get somewhat warmer, but we'll continue to master that and we'll continue to flourish if we have the freedom to use fossil fuels.